The box formation is a tactic as old as time itself, and it still most definitely has a place in Total War Warhammer. But how, where, when and why can we most efficiently use a box? Let's go! Now there's two kinds of box, the unplanned kind of impromptu box, and the more planned I've built my army to be a box kind of strategy. Now to start with the unplanned box, I have a great example of from a stream here. This is what inspired the video. Right after making a video about fatigue and telling you not to get caught in force march, here I am about to get caught in force march by a Bretonnian army, which I'm trying to push on quickly before they build an army up. But little did I know, Raponce is able to build like half a stack of horses in one turn, which is a hell of a lot of cavalry mobility to face, and my little early game balanced army wasn't terribly well suited for dealing with that. So I fought this battle, facing down a whole horde of Bretonnian cavalry. Now it's only knights errant, not the most dangerous of cavalries, but there was a lot of them, very wide. They would no doubt have no problem flanking around me, ruining my missiles and really making it difficult. So I opted for a box formation using the mountains as the back of my box in a bid to mostly protect my missiles and stop me from getting flanked. And although my box is only made of crappy skeletons, it did the job. So this can be a tougher way to do a box, but sometimes necessary if the situation calls for it. You may not always have great tools for the job, but it still can be effective. And as an example of a planned box, this is from my Gorbad campaign video. Some of you might remember I did a big spear box for taking on the ogres, and specifically the ogres because most of their army tends to be large, so having scheisse tons of spears usually works out pretty well. And again, this is early game, so these crappy orc spearmen are going to do the job against these early game ogre units. But the difference here is that I plan to use the army in this way against this specific foe, army, faction, whatever, and thus I'm giving myself a strength and using it against the enemy's weakness. So those are the two main ways you might go about using a box, and both are very situational. It's not always going to be a good idea to box up, but there are some things we can do to help ourselves make a good box. So what do we need for a solid box? Dwarfs. Dwarfs, of course, they are the champions of the box formation, although you don't actually need them. But they are one of the best at it because of their sturdiness. They've got that high armor, sometimes with a shield, high leadership, and high melee defense. Any unit with that combination is going to be incredibly sturdy and fantastic for a box because they won't break easily. And while some factions, those with lots of heavy armor, are going to be better at boxes, I believe that pretty much any faction can pull off a box in some form, as long as you do it properly and in the right situation. So how do we build a good box? Well, first of all, we're going to need a front line. The most important part of the box that we need to think about, especially if you're trying to use something like Empire Swordsmen who don't have the armor, leadership, or melee defense to really be good for this job. But if it's early game Empire campaign and you need to box up for some reason, one way to improve survivability of a unit is to make it a little deeper and make the front less wide, because that means less men are going to be fighting, thus the unit will take damage more slowly and be better for holding out longer. Although don't forget, unbreakable units are going to be incredibly good for this as well because they won't go anywhere. Also, if your front line is pulled wide and thin, there's a good chance a monster or monstrous infantry could push through that and get inside your box really easily. This is the problem for even the chunkiest of the chunky iron breakers for the dwarves. This will still happen to them if they're pulled too thin. So generally, I'd say make the front line of your box shorter and thicker. In most situations, that's probably going to be better, but it depends what other units you've got. This is, of course, overall going to make your box smaller, but that's not necessarily a problem. There is some risk involved with ranged units being so tightly packed together, they could all easily be disrupted, but we'll get to that. So you've got your nice thick frontline units. Those are a good start for the front of a box, but what we really need is some reserve units. Here I've got some halberds and some great swords ready to go to fill any holes that might form in the front of the box. So I'd say the front is the main part to worry about. You want to build a big strong front to your box because that's where most of the enemies are likely going to aim for. Some will flank around to the sides, and honestly, the AI being the AI, it probably won't really come around the back, but obviously you want something there in case it does. So you're kind of building your box like a tank. You want it strong and sturdy at the front, still strong but less strong on the sides, and then kind of weak at the back is okay. To also be aware of what type of units you have and what type of enemies might be running at your front line. If they're sending a lot of infantry your way, then putting your infantry fighters up there is the best choice, but if they're sending a lot of large cavalry monsters, then switch those out for your spearmen instead and let them do the fighting at the front because they're better suited for the job, right? Anti-large bonus charge defense, etc. So do pay attention to the enemy front line and what they're sending your way and move around if necessary. And so if it's an impromptu box, it might look something like this. I'm using cavalry as the back of the box, which is, pretty pretty sturdy, but not the ideal thing for cavalry to be doing. Anyway, once you've got your box, you're probably going to want to fill it with missiles and artillery. This is the most common way to use a box, typically bringing a fair amount of artillery so that you can blow the crap out of the enemy before they reach you, and when they do reach you, they're going to be pretty depleted. But do be aware of the type of ranged units you bring. You'll want high trajectory units, things like bows, crossbows, mortars, so that they can keep firing for the entire battle, as they'll be able to fire over your infantry and still keep hurting the enemy while they're fighting your front line. As opposed to things like handgunners or cannons, these have a low trajectory and thus can't shoot infantry when it's fighting your infantry. They'll only be able to shoot any large that there might be. So if you're planning to blast the crap out of the enemy army, you'll want more of the higher trajectory things so that they can keep fighting once the enemy meets your box. But a box doesn't have to be about using ranged and artillery in the middle. You can just make a really tanky box that the enemy won't be able to flank you through, and thus you can make the battle a real war of attrition by simply outlasting them and tanking all their damage, which can be especially effective if you build for an enemy weakness, like I mentioned earlier with the Orcs versus Ogre thing. So factions like the Dwarfs, Chaos Dwarfs, Nurgle, Lizardmen, the more tanky factions could be good at this kind of box. Here I am doing it with Chaos with nothing but a whole ton of Chaos Warriors, holding off 2 stacks of Skaven infantry mostly, and I'm pretty much just trying to weather the storm of them, just outlasting them, using some magic in places. This is one of the nice things about having a nice straight front line and all the enemies coming to get you, is they will be lined up nicely for magic spells. So that's something you could plan into your box if you are going to build an army specifically to box up. Think about some good wind spells that you could bring, or any abilities that can deal with long lines of crowds like this. So those are the main 2 ways to win with a box. Either you bring a lot of range, or you try to tank out the enemy, or maybe somewhere in between. And don't be surprised if eventually your box starts to fall apart, and it may actually be beneficial to break the box up and just start pushing out after the enemy. So don't be fooled into thinking that a box is just a simple, super easy tactic to pull off, because there are things that can go wrong, things you might have to adjust for. It's Total War, there's always going to be a lot of variables. Which is why a faction like the Beastmen, who you'll pretty much never ever see performing box tactics, could kind of pull off some box tactics in certain situations. Something like this, maybe not. This is just like a normal Beastmen army, but their infantry, most of it is really not designed to be any kind of holding frontline unit. They don't have good leadership, armor, or melee defense, most of them. So yeah, Beastmen, not great for this kind of tactic. But maybe if the enemy does have a lot of cavalry and you don't, well, maybe it would be worthwhile trying out a box. Or maybe you've got the situational tactic box, like I mentioned earlier. If you're about to run into a fight with some ogres and you bring just a whole bunch of corn gores and maybe some missiles, well, that could be okay. So I think most factions probably have a way to make a box work, although I feel like maybe Bretonnia wouldn't, because their infantry is so terrible in terms of leadership and everything. But hey, maybe if you get creative, but probably a cavalry box would be the best thing for Bretonnia. As a couple of examples, here's a Cathay army built to box. Celestial Dragon Guard up front, they're going to be the most sturdy infantry. Jade Warrior Halberds on the sides, and then at the back we've got 4 units of Jade Warriors, just for some extra infantry killing power if we need it, and a little bit cheaper at the back. Then I've got 4 units of Fire Rain Rockets. These are going to do most of the damage to this infantry-heavy Greenskins army. I also have a single unit of Crane Gunners, who are a low trajectory unit, but we've got them on a bit of a slope at some height so they can look down on the enemy. I've also got some Iron Hell Gunners, same thing with those, but these kind of shotgun units are incredibly helpful for when a big single entity tries to charge into the box, because they'll absolutely lay it out quick. I've also got the Zangu War Drum buffing up the reload time and melee attack of all nearby units. So with this army, I'm purposely blowing the crap out of everything before it reaches me, and by the time it does, it's usually pretty blasted up, so it doesn't really have the beef to get through the sturdy front. Or how about a similar idea with the Skaven? I've got a Storm Vermin frontline who won't do tons of damage, but they're reasonably tanky, and then we just got a lot of mortar-style units, Poison Wind Globadiers, the Death Globe Raw unit, they are absolutely disgusting. Poison Wind Mortars, Catapults, again just battering the enemy from range, and by the time they reach us, they'll be pretty beaten up and worn down, and we should be able to out-tank them from there. Another tool that can be good to have in an army like this as well is something with a bit more heavy mass, in case something like a big boy mammoth comes along and you need to stop it just charging straight into your box. Monstrous infantry, single entities, lords, heroes, anything that can get in the way of these big boys and keep them out the box. So yeah, get creative if you're going to build a kind of planned box to use over and over again, although do be aware that not every box is going to work against every kind of enemy army composition, so don't by any means expect 100% success. And with that, I should mention the biggest threat to a lot of heavy ranged army builds, box or not, and that is of course flying units. If the enemy army has a lot of flying units, you may want to reconsider how you approach this. Because flying units don't give two shits about how thick the front of your box is, they're just going to go straight over it anyway, so you got to think about that. This is the risk of having a smaller box, not that this one is too small, but if you've got a really small, tightly packed box, a single unit of flyers could probably get all over and disrupt those missiles if it wanted to. So try to space them out as much as you can, but if there are a lot of flyers, you may need a different strategy. And lastly, just a few extra little things to think about. First of all, when you're putting your box down, you could use part of the terrain or map to act as one side of your box, as I did in one of the first examples with the Tomb Kings. Like here, I'm going to use the river, meaning that this left side of my box isn't really needed anymore, and I can now put these units on to buff the front line or wherever. This kind of thing can raise a bit of a moral question though. I personally think it's fine to use part of the terrain or map to aid you in this kind of way. What I'm not a fan of though, because it feels cheesy to me, is to use the map border. This white edge, I don't want to use that as part of my box, even though I could if I put my army over here and I moved it all the way back, I could use that as the back of my box. To me, that feels a little cheesy, a little cheaty. I don't like it. It's part of the video game, but not part of the world. If this was real life, let's say, that wouldn't be there, right? So you wouldn't be able to utilize it. So for me, and for immersion's sake, I won't use it, but I will use parts of the terrain. But if you want to use it, it's a single player game. Who gives a fuck? Do what you like. Unless you're playing multiplayer, then you're a cheeseball if you do use this, so up to you. The biggest benefit of this though is that you do gain an impenetrable side to your box and you free up those extra units to put somewhere else. Your best bet is probably just to send them up to the front line and bolster that, or have them in reserve and they can go wherever's needed. And of course, a no-brainer with this kind of tactic, any kind of high ground is going to be incredibly advantageous to a box, especially making the enemy run uphill to wear them out, so always keep an eye out for that. Another way we can utilize terrain to our advantage is by going and hiding in the forest, if the enemy has a lot of large units. And especially if you're the Wood Elves, because they gain some advantages fighting in trees anyway, like their missiles ignoring the trees so they won't get blocked by them. But the advantage for everyone here is that any large unit that fights in a forest will suffer a speed and melee attack debuff, and that melee attack debuff is what we're after. That will give, in this case, -8 melee attack. It's a percentage. So for these Rot Knights, that's a pretty substantial debuff to their melee attack, which means they're not going to do as much damage, and our box will survive better. Well, like I say, this is only really going to be worth doing if the enemy has a lot of monsters that you can take advantage of this with. If it's only 1 or 2 units of monsters, probably not worth it, just because fighting in the forest is so damn ugly and difficult to stomach. Another useful way you can buff the front of your box is with spells and abilities. Here comes Carl to drop a little stand your ground, buffing the melee defense up of these frontline units, helping them survive better, and then moving along, dropping the Reichland Runefang, that's buffing melee attack, so a little more killy for these units. These kind of buffs, whether from passing lords or maybe a hero that you've just embedded with the front of your box to help buff them up, can be very helpful. Also, don't be afraid to send some units outside the box. For example, Carl is a good example of this. He's got Terror. He can be great for attacking in the flank of all these low leadership units. He'll rout and Terror rout them off. Or if you've got a unit of cavalry you don't need as a wall of your box, or maybe it's later and the box is kind of falling apart, some hammer and anvil can always be good on those frontline units. Once they're all engaged and blobbed up on the front of your box, they can be some easy pickings. But there we go, some box tactics to mess around with. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. If you'd like more of this tactical stuff, I've got a whole playlist right here. And if you'd like to consider supporting the channel, do check out the memberships below. Otherwise, I will see you in the future.